Good morning, I'm Artistic Director Ryan Turner, and welcome to our live-streamed open rehearsal of Cantata 124, Meinen, Jesum, nicht. The way we run these rehearsals is somewhat out of order from largest forces to diminishing forces, and you'll notice things are a little different for us. Everyone is masked. You might see over here our oboist Jen Slowick in her plexiglass enclosure to minimize aerosols, and our singers are spread out, so we have a slightly different setup. Great to have you here. Please join us afterwards, starting at 12:15 for a lecture with myself and my colleague Pamela Dalal on this cantata. And we will begin with the opening movement and then jump to the final movement and then jump around as it is. From the top. This little trill is, the text here is about I'll never let go of my Jesus. And the setup is that the gospel reading is about the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple who is left behind by his parents. And his parents frantically can't find him. They rush back and they find him having a deep theological debate with elders of the church. And the text here is, I will never let my Jesus go. And it's this feeling of a parent that never wants to lose their child again. And this opening trill is, later on in the text, they talk about clinging to Jesus like a burr or a thorn clings to one's clothing or skin. And I think the trill is the snag of the burr, getting stuck on the clothing and then the release of it. we'll get used to it. Lauren?
All right, I was just asking Joe if they can move over a little bit.
Oh,
Is that okay, do you think?
No, you cannot.
no, okay.
You need to be on the blue to be far enough for Jennifer, but other people could move if you need, sorry.
Okay, I can't see Sarah. Yeah. What if I move back a little?
Yeah, you can move.
Yeah, why don't you move back a bit, Susanna?
Or Susanna move to the right, and Lauren, you can move right forward. You just need to be a distance from six.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure. That's let me know if my head
And we can move the camera, that's fine.
Yeah.
Balance up?
It's really good. You guys are great. Continue to be a little more spiky. They're delegated 16th, so different than the other string.
Got it, okay. Good. When you all get the dotted 8th, 16th motion, just make sure you're matching the upper strings. I think it can have a little bit more lift to it. Feels a little longer than there, so it's not quite matching. I also think when you get D, it needs just a little bit more bite on that trill. It feels like the burr was released too easily.
In measure 60.
60?
Yes.
Okay.
Trill to a natural or a sharp? Sorry, it's D natural or D sharp.
I think we have to do D sharp.
I had natural written and then it
Or not. Hold on a second.
kind of flashed. 60?
No.
Natural?
Okay. Yep. 99. That is F sharp, right? F sharp.
Well, what about the D? I have it marked.
Oh, the D at the end. D sharp. Yep. Sharp. Upper string. Say that again? That one spot for them coming out of it, that it's a D sharp, but you're D natural on the trill if it's from the C sharp. Yeah. Upper strings, bar 45, as you did, but just to clarify, a lift before the second beat, and then the second beat's always slightly longer, pim, pom, pium, pom, just a little bit more length in contrast to what we've been doing. Suzanne, I felt like the dotted figure worked.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go back and do a few more things again and make sure that we've worked out some ensemble. Yeah. No, I don't think so. You're great. I'm just aware that you never get a break. That's your little concerto. And I'm going to step out a few times and listen on the headphones so I know what the live stream audience is hearing. Yeah. Can we have just a little more lift before the second beat? Great. Thank you. Opening without Susanna and Jen, just so we get our quarters together. So it's, yeah. One more time. Everyone, Tootsie from the beginning. can I hear, just lining up our dotted figure, 56, 57, 58, that we don't get stuck in the bar, yum, button, button. So there's a little bit more sense of traveling all the way through the longer phrase. Can we take 56, 5, 6? Here's up. Quick things. Susanna, I think in 92 and in 94, that can be as sort of, rustic and full-bodied as you want. Continuo, 97 and 99, if there's a way we can get a little bit of space or release before the 16ths, even under one bow, that'd be great. Otherwise, I feel like it kind of gets a little swallowed up together. Susanna, at the end there, 120, when you finally get that one measure or two measures of oboe figure, I think you have to do it with complete abandon. Like we finally let you loose. And if we can all be aware of the last three bars of the hemiola, so Susanna goes, yada pa 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 pira pa 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 ti pa 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 pa. Feel like it's a big 3-2 bar. That'd be great. Continuo, the final thing I want to say is 112. I think we can just sort of lean into that D natural, so the 6-4-2 chord just a shade more. Balances. And an ensemble with Jen, which seems fine from up here, but it's reading.
The only thing I would say is that sometimes when she's in the middle of her lula, that the strings don't always completely catch it. It feels like they're making a tiny bit of it.
Okay, so making sure that our quarter notes stay poised, I think, is the main thing, that we don't ever tip forward, which will give her just a little more room.
Yeah, actually, they're, like the second part, I'm a little late, so I will try to...
We'll meet in the middle.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Let's just take one of those phrases, see if we can take the second half of this, some of these spots that I just brought up. How about, can we take it at 94? The vocal lift, it's at 94 to the end? Sorry, 84. 84.
Would you mind? What's the text there?
Erst minus Lebens. 8-4. You know what it is? Sorry. Sometimes our third beat, I think we have these 2-bar phrases, in our zeal to get to the next downbeat, the third beat wants to rush. Yum, pum, pum, pum. Yum, pum, 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 pum. We can still phrase to it without rushing to it. Also, upper strings. Can I hear you once? 9/6. I think we need to be in contrast to what the continua are doing. Sort of brushed and light, feathery. 9/6. Not with it, no, just upper strings. Is up. Lighter on the second beat, one more time. Tick tock. Pum, pim, pum, pum. Add the continual in. 9/6, and just not to rush the third beat of the second bar of each of those phrases. 9/6 is yeah. It's always the second measure of those phrases, the third beat. I feel like we want to rush the down. We need to listen to the continual because they have bum, bi-yum, da-ga-dum. They got to lock into their 16th. Same spot, 9/6 is You might have overachieved. Excellent. Can we go back to 92 to the end? 9-2 to the end, and then we have to move on. 9-2. This is your moment. One of yours is you. Sure that the downbeat of the penultimate bar is not weighted. That will, if we head to the second beat of the penultimate bar, that will do the trick. Can we take it right at 116? 116 to the end. Yeah? Great. Can we jump to the final chorale, please? Okay. Oh, you will be aiming out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Final chorale. The important thing, a few little things in here. Third bar between beats 2 and 3 is a comma. I mean, just a little lift, not necessarily a comma. And then the other comma spot, where was that? Zilish, yes. Bar 10 between beats 2 and 3. The last 2 bars, sort of piano flautando, really light. So the duet ends in A. Oh, are we in the right spots? Yeah, we are. Exactly right.
Okay.
Zu
Balance. Are you getting enough text? Internal? Okay. Great. Let's just do it one more time. As much as continual and will can really lock in, I feel like you're the sort of, the text in here says, Jesus, I will walk and never leave his side. And I feel like you're that accompanying partner of Jesus there that needs to really feel like you're guiding in a way. To get to that fermata, just place it a little bit. Can you take it, please? Bar 10. Bar 10. Yes. Bravo. Great. Let's do the bass recit so that you can lead.
All right.
Bass recitative, which is number 4.
Where am I going to be?
You. Why don't you be just right there?
Right here? All right.
Yeah. Actually, I think that will work.
Like
Right.
on the floor, or
Maybe just up a step or something.
am I going to be too close to you?
No, I can move. That's the beauty.
All right.
I know how to do that. Number 4. Tortured through bar 7 and then relief.
Ach, welch schweres Ungemach empfindet noch all hier die Seele. Wird nicht die hart gekränkte Brust zu einer Wüstenei und matte Höhle bei Jesu schmerzlichstem Verlust? Allein mein Geist sich gläubig auf und an den Ort, wo Glaub und Hoffnung prangen, allwo ich nach vollbrachtem Lauf dich, Jesu, ewig soll umfangen.
Michael. Bar 8. Did you play a 7/6 there?
Yes, but I have it.
Oh, you do? I like it. I don't have it, but I like it.
Yeah, I don't know where it comes from, but it's there. It's right.
Sure.
It's in print, too.
In bar 6, it feels like the C sharp C natural needs to feel like it really is a little more sinuous to the B, to the downbeat of 7. More sustained, I'd say. And if there's some way we can feel in the second bar that the A sharp is connected to the B without it, I mean, just that there's a direction to it, even if there's space, if that makes sense. Likewise, the G natural then going to the F sharp, going to that third bar. I think we just do this again. At least once.
Doch ach, welch schweres Ungemach empfindet noch all hier die hartgekränkte Brust zu einer Wüstenei und matte Hülle bei Jesu schmerzlichstem Verlust. Allein mein Geist sich gläubig auf und an den Ort, wo Glaub und Hoffnung prangen, allwo ich nach vollbrachtem Lauf dich, Jesu, ewig soll umfangen.
That's great. Just make sure bar 9, that downbeat, give Will just a split more time for his glottal. Ort, because he sort of places that mystery sharp.
Nice.
Good. Anything, Michael?
Was that not a pun? Oh, art means place.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go Bills.
We're going to do number 3, the tenor aria. So there, to me, this is a sort of deranged saraband, and in the strings, the 16ths, if you can feel like they are like the funeral drum, almost without shape, ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba. Really try not to be musical. Until there is these little 2-bar sequences in which the tenor suddenly is in sixths with the oboe, and the text changes, and he talks about, even though the harsh blow of death is coming, I find comfort in Jesus, and I have confidence. And that's when there's this little sort of amorous duet for 3 bars that happens between the d'amore and the tenor. In those spots, 24, 25, then that funeral drum motive suddenly warms and softens, and it goes, ba ba ba, tiara. And it's just for 2 bars that it happens. 24, 25, and then every time that figure happens, the next time is 50, 51, and then again 60, 61. It's just those 3 times. Otherwise, ba 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 ba, really square. Continua, as much as you can maintain a unrelenting staccato character, and again, it's almost try not to phrase too much, other than to always be cognizant of the second beat being the strongest in the bar. The only places where you start, it's like you can't stand it anymore, and you have to break free of it when you get to your dotted figures. But then you're always brought back to bop, bop, back to that square nature. And all the same time, you should be completely clueless any of this is happening. And you're just singing this wide-arching melody that just ignore everybody else. Yeah. Let's try it. Full strings. Yep, pop, pop, pop. Can we do this once without the oboe once? No oboe, just from the beginning. And I think quite full. Yapapapam is raw. More viola? Yes. And then legato. Great. Always make sure when we get to the 8s that are coupled that we head to the second beat. So in bar 8, and then away. And bring back the energy of that. Yeah, you can hardly do too much.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, I'll be aware of it. By the oboe? Tick, tock. Not to be late, strings. Go to the second beat. Great, can we stop? Can we go more to the second beat and can we to be shorter? Just play it and get out of the way. Can we, right where we just left off, 2-7?
2 what?
2-7. And don't adjust to anything you hear in the oboe. You have to just block her out and adjust metronomic. Is nice and full strings.
In the third bar, after those two places where we had the 2 bars of warmth, are we back to the original articulation on bar 3, or are we still down?
Yes. What we should do is prepare it. So 23, maybe that gesture dims the slightest bit, so that 24 and 25 are in the warm character. And then 27 immediately, immediately back to the drum. Does that make sense?
Yes, but it's 25 where...
Oh yeah, 25, you're still in that warm character where it's from the front of the gesture and away. You will never, upper strings, run the risk of being too much for Omar or for Jen. I think this needs to be a full sort of raw sound, the more we can feel it's drum-like, the better. Can we do this opening one more time with that in mind? And also, always remembering the second beat. In the continuo, the more you can give us yum, bum, bum, strong second beats would be great. Who needs to be closer together? The screen? There you go, right there. Perfect. Good. So start strong, even though the second beat is important. That doesn't mean we're going to start like pa 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 pa. Go. Once again. Tick tock. Coming along. I think we'll sort of coalesce a bit more tomorrow. Great. Thank you, upper strings. Thank you, Jen. Let's do your russet, and thank you. And then we'll do the final duet. So this is russet number 2. Feels like we should be long through the middle of 3.
Especially 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah.
Conflicting stuff in there.
I think maybe we just sustain to the downbeat of Jesum, and then, do we need that?
No, I don't think so, but I'm not going to go, so we'll just keep it simple. Let's see if that works.
Solange sich ein Tropfen Blut in Herz und Adern reget,
sustaining for
No,
verses?
no. I don't like that. I don't like just that. Just that.
So we just do nothing? Let the show cadence and then.
I think it should be fine without anything. It's got to be long or short. That's all.
Let's do it without. Just cadence and get out of his way. We're not quite. Do you need another area? We're not quite locked in. Which I know is hard because it sits high. I get it. Once again, here we are.
Solange sich ein Tropfen Blut in Herz und Adern regt, soll Jesus nur allein mein Leben und mein Alles sein. Mein Jesus, der an mir so große Dinge tut, ich kann ja nichts als meinen Leib und Leben ihm zum Geschenke geben.
Good. You like that better? Yeah. Good. Bravo.
Awesome.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.
This is Omar's first Bach solo with us. Bravo. All right, in our duet. Yeah? failed a little Latin.
Great.
And just remember,
Yes.
that's all. Tempo feel okay there?
Yeah.
Good. Can we do a B section and then go back? In the opening return, I feel like that needs just a little lengthening each time, a gotcha. Why don't we do the little play out of the ritornelle, pick up to 71, and then into the B section? Does that work? How's it feel? Not the right person to ask, huh? Is that doable tempo-wise?
Yeah.
Good. Comfy?
Yeah.
It's a weird turn on each phrase in the B section.
Oh, yeah.
There's a pattern, and then it curves. And it does it every time, so I always.
That's great. That's better. It's better, yeah. We'll sort out a brilliant end of the B section tomorrow. We'll save that. Good. I mean, I think the whole idea of this is just absolute abandon. Enjoy. Great. Thank you all. And thank you to our listeners. We'll take a break and come back in about 10 to 15 minutes for the lecture. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Turner, Artistic Director of Emmanuel Music. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Pamela Dalal, mezzo-soprano in the ensemble, and our translator. All of the cantatas on our website, actually all of the vocal works that we've ever performed on our website have been translated by Pamela Dalal. She is one of my colleagues, along with Michael Beatty, that are the new leadership team of the Bach Institute. Typically during the Bach Institute at this time after a cantata rehearsal, Pam and I would sit down with the students in the Institute and talk about the cantata of the day as it relates to the text, what's happening liturgically and what's happening musically. Well, here we are in 2021 without students, but we're with you. And so what Pam and I are going to do is sort of give a brief overview or orientation that we're calling Cantatas 101, an introduction to cantatas. And then we'll move on to cite specific examples from the cantata that will be performed tomorrow morning, Cantata 124, Meinen, Jesum, ich nicht. So I'm thrilled to have Pam with us, and I'm going to hand it over to Pam now to talk about Cantatas 101.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. When we begin our study of Bach arias, Bach cantatas with usually a population of students, I find that there are questions that sometimes have never been addressed about basic things. For instance, what is a cantata? So you might think that you know and everyone has some idea, but in fact, the form of the cantata that we think of when we think of a Bach cantata is not the original form of a cantata or the only type of cantata that can be conceived. In fact, the term cantata originates in the very beginning of the 17th century in Italy, and it represents a piece of music written for voices or voices and instruments. And it applies very broadly to solo works or works with multiple soloists, vocal ensemble. Cantatas can have only a continual accompaniment or can have various instruments. It's also not specifically a sacred text. In fact, most of the early cantatas were secular texts, love stories, etc., etc. Cantatas don't have to be several movements. They can be one continuous movement. In the earlier part of the German Baroque period, you will hear cantatas that run continuously, whether they are all in one tempo or they have certain sectional changes. So by the time that Bach was writing cantatas, he was stepping into a genre and a tradition that had already been going for more than 100 years and had a lot of variation and a lot of creativity. So Bach's cantatas have in their own history an evolution. If you know his earliest works, like Cantata 106, which is Gottes Zeit, or Christ lag in Todesbanden, which is the cantata number 4, you have probably become aware of something that has a very fluid structure where movements sometimes even seem to blend into each other. And that he got a lot from his predecessor, Buxtehude, who also wrote many beautiful cantatas and sort of created a sectional but seamless structure. It seems very obvious that Bach was excited about writing cantatas and very interested in finding a position where he could write more of them. And in various different parts of his life, you see this motivation. The first posting that he had where he was able to write a number of church cantatas was at Weimar, the court at Weimar. But he was driven to continue to apply for new positions, and when he landed in Leipzig, he finally found a place where he would be able to compose a new church cantata for every single liturgical event, mostly Sundays, but also feast days. So it's exciting to engage the works that Bach writes in his first couple of years of Leipzig, because you sort of have this sense of a composer who's finally got the tools and the opportunity to use this form and develop it and make it evolve. It's often a question that I think people are confused about. Well, where do these texts come from? If you're not thinking very hard about that, you might just equate the words with Bach himself. But there is absolutely no evidence that Bach wrote any of these libretti. In fact, the evidence that we do have points to pre-existing poetry that was circulating widely in Lutheran Germany. In fact, there were a number of poets based in Leipzig who were writing these poems, possibly intending for them to be set to music, but not definitely. They were clearly meant to be devotional texts. They would incorporate biblical quotes, chorales, which of course are hymns that are sung in the congregation and are probably known extremely well by everyone in the congregation, and newly written poetic verses that can generally be sorted easily into something like an aria and something like a recitative. In fact, so if you look at Buxtehude's cantatas and you look at Bach's early cantatas, you don't see these kinds of poetic forms. And there was a bit of controversy. Certain very conservative people in the church felt that this was introducing opera into the sacred worship service, and that somehow this was inappropriate. Bach was not the only composer doing this. These libretti are very clear proof that there was a sort of a groundswell of interest in dramatizing the spiritual experience. And particularly in Bach, we see something I would like to call the spiritual journey. Almost every cantata takes us on some kind of an arc. So we might start with a simple expression of faith and love, and then as we go further into that, discover that some of these things are hard to be at peace with or to make work in your daily life. Maybe you have trouble with people who are persecuting you, or trouble with fear of death, which is for certain a very big subject. We will see that very thing come up in our cantata this week. So let me talk a little bit more about some of the different kinds of libretti we have. We do think that Bach cantatas have a regular form. Like, I think you might say an opening chorus, a closing chorale, and then sort of alternation of aria, recit, aria for different soloists. But you know, even the use of chorus or the use of a variety of soloists is not a given. We have cantatas for one solo voice. We have cantatas that never use a chorus, and a few cantatas that never end with chorales. The sad thing is that even though we know that these libretti were circulating in Leipzig, we don't always know who wrote them. In the entire collection of cantatas that Bach set, I don't have an exact number, but it's probably less than 30% have a name that we can attach. And in his second year in Leipzig, so when he arrived in Leipzig in 1723, he was very excited about getting to create all these new works, but in practice he did recycle a few pieces that he had written to fill out the Sundays. By the time he got to his second year, he felt that, we assume, he felt that he was ready to challenge himself to compose a new work every week. And in fact, that is what he did. He also further challenged himself by deciding that every single cantata that he composed in this liturgical year would be structured on a chorale. And what that means is that he had a pre-existing hymn, And some poet, sadly, we will probably never know who this poet or various poets were, had created a libretto based on this hymn. In a few minutes, Ryan and I will sort of walk through how the chorale text informs the various themes of the cantata itself. But each cantata that he wrote had the same structure. Most of them started with a verbatim setting of the opening stanza of the hymn, of the chorale, in the first movement, and concluded with the final stanza in a usually much more simple four-voice harmonization. In the middle, Bach did various different things. He might use quotes from bits of the melody, or he might use, the librettist might be handing him literal quotes from stanzas that are set in an aria form or a recit form, and those quotes may or may not be associated with the melody. I think a misconception that sometimes happens when you hear the term chorale cantata, that you imagine that the melody is present in every movement. Because we think chorale fantasia and the chorale is sort of permeating the music. But that's not true. In fact, the way that the melody appears or doesn't appear in middle movements is quite diverse. And in our cantata, we don't, in fact, hear the beautiful chorale melody except in the first movement and the last movement. So I think that the basic elements of Bach's idea of what a chorale, or what a cantata is, has reached a certain point by this time, which is 1724 to 1725. Even in all of these chorale cantatas that he writes, he varies the form a lot. Sometimes the chorale melody is in the top voice where we expect it to be. Sometimes it's in one of the inner parts. Sometimes it's in the bass, which is an extraordinary and exciting variation. Sometimes he writes a very modern orchestral texture, like a concerto grosso format, or in this case, a minuet. Sometimes he writes a very old sort of passacaglia, sounding like a Renaissance piece where it's all polyphonic. Sometimes he incorporates elaborate fugues. Sometimes he sets the text and the vocal parts of the chorale very simply. So there's a lot of experimentation, I think we can say. So let's think a little bit more about today's cantata. Ryan, why don't you set up sort of where we are in the liturgical year?
Yeah, so this cantata, 124, Meinen Jesum ich nicht, was written in that second Jahrgang, the second cycle that Pam referenced, where he engaged on this ambitious effort of a chorale cantata for every Sunday of the church year. This one was premiered, first performed on the 7th of January, 1725, which was the first Sunday after Epiphany. Interesting to note that, Epiphany falls on the 6th of January, which means that the day before that, he had his forces perform a brand new cantata for the Sunday of Epiphany, which was cantata, incidentally, 123. The numbering is coincidental. It's not chronological. And that was, and so then he had the very next Sunday, the very next day, had to present another brand new cantata that he had just composed. So that alone to me is an astounding testament to his compositional efforts. The readings of the day for this first Sunday after Epiphany come from the second chapter of Luke, in which Jesus is at the temple and his parents leave him there, 12-year-old Jesus. And there's this moment of anxiety and franticness of the parents searching for their lost Jesus. They come back to the temple and they find him having this theological, philosophical debate with the elders, the teachers of the church. And they ask it, and Jesus says, "How did you not know I would be at my Father's house? Like, what else would I be doing?" And that is sort of the stepping off point for this cantata. Now, I will say that the cantata never directly really references that gospel reading. There is also the epistle reading of the day, which comes from the 12th chapter of Romans, and that really deals about the body as a sacrifice and the transformation through renewal of mind and making sure that you regard oneself with moderation, and we are all one in Christ. In the tenor recitative, there is a sort of vague reference to the body as a sacrifice. So this, unlike other cantatas, does not always have direct references to the liturgical readings of the day, but is always in dialogue with it. And Pam will talk more about the text, but I would say this idea of, Meinen Jesum ich nicht, my Jesus, I will never leave you, is of course the cry of the anxious parent that I will never leave my son again. So Bach's congregation, of course, would have made this reference, I think, quite easily. And we see this throughout the whole cantata, the reference to not leaving Jesus, or not the believer not leaving Jesus, that will cling tightly to him.
Yes. So actually, we have the text of the cantata for you to look at, and also certain relevant verses from the chorale. This particular hymn has 18 verses, but obviously not every single chorale stanza appears in libretto. So the verses that we have for you to look at pretty much correspond to the various movements that the anonymous librettist reworked. If you look at the chorale text, you'll see that the last line of every single verse is Meinen Jesum lass ich nicht. So it's a refrain, kind of a mantra. And I think that it has a lot of resonances, not only the gospel story of losing Jesus, and when the bass in the recitative says the most painful loss of Jesus, that obviously has clear overtones of the Passion and the crucifixion, but it also has a little reference to this idea of where did he go? We've lost him, right? It also has a resonance of the fight of Jacob or Israel with the angel. Because in that story, he says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. It is this amazing sort of divine wrestling match. And this idea of holding on to salvation, instead of leaving or abandoning, it's really about, I'm not going to let go. I've got you in my hands. And some of the imagery in the text, as we will see, this beautiful Klettenweiß an ihm zu kleben. I'm going to stick to him like a burr. Kind of has not only this very powerful quality, but it's also very, very simple language. It's language that anyone can relate to, because it refers to sort of everyday things. And I think that particular character of the hymn is carried over into this libretto. It makes me so sad that we don't know who these librettists were, because some of the libretti of the chorale cantatas are really quite elaborately worked and very, very beautifully structured. So what we see, if we look at the chorale, first verse is, as I said, sung verbatim in the cantata. In the second verse, I have all the confidence I have given of what I am. Sounds very positive. As long as I live on earth. That's the hint. Because the third verse goes right into this image of what it will mean when I'm going to leave the earth. In other words, when I die. Let the last day's light of the world reach me as the thread of life breaks. No matter what I'm going to experience, what is going to remain constant, as that last line reminds us, is I will not let go of Jesus. And we do hear precisely that imagery in the tenor aria, where the tenor aria really plunges us into a visceral, real-time experience of dying. But the librettist does maintain that last line so that we feel the connection between how the chorale explains or goes through this experience and how the librettist has reworked it. Then, as I mentioned, in the recitative, the bass takes this idea of death being a frightening experience and starts to take us on a different perspective by saying, but the world is terrible. I have so much hardship, and when I'm here on earth, I feel that I've lost Jesus. So why shouldn't I want to rejoin him? Why shouldn't I want to go to that place where faith and hope are resplendent? Prangen, this beautiful German word, after my completed course. So this is the turning point of the cantata. And this is what I meant earlier when I talked about a journey. Because we started with this wonderful, confident, I'm sticking with Jesus. Then we discover that as you live your life, it's not always easy to do that, especially when you think about dying, because dying is the most existential crisis that a living being can experience. But as we discover, maybe dying isn't so bad. If what it means is I can be reunited with Jesus. And that brings us to, if we look back at the chorale text, we see those same themes being worked out. So in the fourth verse of the chorale, we say, I won't leave him when I've actually reached that place where I am before his face, vor seinem Angesicht, right? God is always the way we refer to that, but God and Jesus being one. And then the fifth verse tells us, that's what I'm going to do. This is definitely what I want to do. I want to get out of here. I want to get to Jesus as soon as I can. So it's a sort of conclusion of how I'm going to go through life, because instead of being afraid of death, it's a good thing. And why not let it come quickly? So in the cantata, the poet has given us this sense of hurry, islands, let's get this over with kind of thing. You will find in heaven your true delight, and this is what's going to revive or refresh your longing heart. So it's an interesting little arc. It actually sounds rather simplistic when you describe it, but of course, the genius of Bach's cantatas is that there's always so much being said by the music, the forms that he chooses, the harmonies that he chooses, the textures.
That's great. Yeah, I want to pick up on a few strands that you brought up and see how we can weave it into what's happening in the score. The first one is this concept of journey, of a spiritual journey, and I would say a musical journey. And in this cantata specifically, the opening chorus starts with three disparate elements. We have the strings that are playing a minuet. We have the oboe, which is d'amore, which is essentially an oboe d'amore concerto. And then we have the block chorale tune with some imitation and suspensions happening in the singing. We have three disparate elements. Then we have a tenor recitative. Then we have this tenor aria, which brings in four different elements. Things are getting even more dispersed and less unified. We have in the strings, and I'm going to show the score later on, this sort of funeral drum motive, yap-pa-pa-pa-pa, that keeps repeating. You have a staccato bass line that is unrelenting. You have the voice, which is singing this rather tortured melody with huge odd leaps that suddenly when we hear an octave, the octave sounds so strange because we've gotten used to major sevenths and odd leaps, etc. And then you have the oboe in that aria, which plays this sort of wide-arching, rather lyrical melody. I mean, these four disparate elements, again, we're getting further away from union with God. And I think the tenor aria takes us really far, and then we get to the bass recit. The first 6 or 7 measures of that, most of the tones used in the continuo line are chromatic tones. They're non-diatonic pitches. He's taken us further and further away. It's the point right before, I think, the parents find the child. And then there's this moment of incredible repose and release that happens in the bass recitative when the believer recognizes, oh, I can hold on to you even in death. And that leads us into the soprano-alto duet, which is this sort of, I mean, it's complete joyful abandon. And what I think is interesting is that this duet starts to bring us back to union with Christ and God. And what I mean by that is, musically what happens is, every time the ritornello in the continuo or the cello is played, it always appears in the tonic key. It never ventures outside of the key that we're in, unlike that bass recit before us, which was everywhere but the diatonic key. And then the other thing about it is all these moments of gathering points or union in the soprano and alto, where they're in rhythmic, harmonic, and textual unisons or in consonance and harmony. And then, of course, the culmination of that is the final chorale, where all the voices and instruments are finally singing together the same material. So this big spiritual journey begins with complete, elements in different places, and by the end, we all come together sort of on the same page, singing and playing the same thing, in union with Christ, which is supposed to be the journey of the believer. The other thing I want to talk about that Pam mentioned is the idea of the text being something that is everyday life, or colloquial, or accessible in a way. And the way Bach does that musically, in the big picture, I'll just bring out 3 specific things. The opening movement is a courtly minuet, a dance form that the 18th century congregation would recognize and know. Minuet was familiar. The tenor aria, another dance form, I see it as what I'm calling a deranged saraband. Again, a dance form they would know with a strong second beat. And it's deranged. It's a little, through the looking glass, like an Escher painting. And then the final soprano-alto duet is what was called a passe-pierre, a French, from Brittany actually, dance form that was rapid 3/8 with a pickup. And it was, again, an earthly dance form used to depict a heavenly journey. And so I think there's a way in which Bach uses the dance forms, as it were, of the people to represent spiritual, heavenly, aspirational ideas. And I think this way of melding the two is brilliant. Now to specific examples, and I'm going to ask Brad, who's producing this, to pull up an example for me of the opening chorus, and where we see this minuet in the strings. And I just want to draw your attention to what I think is sort of Bach's sense of humor, is the trill. Bum, bum, ba-da-dum, bum, which to me is the snag of the burr on someone's clothing or something. You're on a walk and you get stuck, and the trill is the snag, and then the release, bum, bum, ba-da-bum, bum, and it releases. There's always a little bit of sense of humor, I think, that Bach brings to the way he treats the music. So we have this figure, and throughout these 3 different groups, the strings playing a minuet, the oboe d'amore playing essentially a concerto, and then the choir singing the chorale tune, they, with very few exceptions, never double each other. They're all in their own sort of worlds that finally, in the end, do indeed come together. So if you see that front opening page of the score, you can see in the 8th measure where the oboe releases itself from the minuet and takes off on this concerto journey. And then when we turn the page and see the chorale tune come in, you can see they're doing their own thing, which really has nothing to do with what's happening in the instrumental parts as well. The next, and I want to just draw your attention also, Pam brought up the line of text, which is Klettenweis an ihn zu kleben. I will cling to him as if fettered. And of course, then the singers all come to a unison on the word kleben, of clinging, and it's a long note. I think it spans, 10 beats or something? It's over 3 bars. And they're clinging, they won't let go. Again, that imagery of I'm going to hold on to you tightly no matter what. The tenor recitative, as I mentioned, there are references in the second half of it, the epistle lesson, the idea of the body as a sacrifice, which then leads us into the third movement. And Brad, if you can bring that up, what I am calling a deranged saraband. And just to go through these 3 figures as you see it on the page there, you can see Bach actually writes, which he doesn't write often, he writes staccato in the bass line. It's very seldom we see Bach actually write some marking like that or a dynamic marking. So we have the staccato happening, and then we have in the strings, pa 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 pa, pa 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 pa, and I see this as this unrelenting funeral drum that is the reminder of the blow of death, the harsh death blow that the tenor is about to sing about. And then, of course, there's the oboe line, which is this sort of wide-arching, tortuous melody that is always seeking to rise, but never makes it, and sort of falls back on itself. And then there's the tenor line, which I mentioned, which you can see at the very first entrance, this sort of incredibly strong dotted rhythm and cries of the voice. It reminds me of Psalm 131, sort of out of the depths I cry to thee. Extreme intervals. And then we also see, if you look at the very opening line of the tenor, und wenn der Herr, the next time he sings the second bit of text, und wenn der Fleisch, is the same figure but inverted, turned upside down. So he's playing with the same figure in many different forms. And if I can draw your attention to what I think is part of just an incredibly tender and touching moment, is measures 23, 24, and 25, where before that he says the days abhorred by flesh bring only fear and terror with them. Yet, my confidence assures itself, or the comfort that is brought to me that brings assurance. And when that happens, suddenly the tenor is in sixths with the oboe d'amore. And we get, it reminds me of a Zelenka love duet. Which of course Bach would have known about Zelenka, who was in Dresden and had a job that he probably really wanted in a way. But it's brief, it's only 2 measures. You can see there, on Doch tröstet sich die Zuversicht, and then the phrase ends, Meinem Jesum lass ich nicht, as each of these phrases end with that as well. We move on to the bass recitative, and as I mentioned, if you look at the do you have that one, Brad? The bass recitative is up. If you look at just the first 7 bars, one really wouldn't know what key we're in. And you can see all the chromatic tones and the sort of tortured feeling of that A sharp that leads to the B. You think you've arrived in a B minor sonority, only to get a G natural going to F sharp. And then we get this plunging bass line, E, D sharp, all this stuff about the sorely plagued breast becomes a wilderness, a pit of martyrdom. Sort of the believer going into the incredibly dark and insecure places of their belief and of this, as you called it, the existential crisis of pondering death.
And also the difficulties of being in the world.
yeah, and of the journey of faith, how difficult it is.
Right.
But then on the A line, we get a 6/4-2 chord that leads us into something that is far more comforting and harmonically pleasing than what came before it. And this sort of, to me, it acts as the harmonic relief of the angst of the tenor aria that necessitates this soprano-alto duet. And as I mentioned, that the alto duet, soprano-alto duet number 5 is this earthly dance, passe-pied, and that is used to depict heavenly things. And of course, just the registration he chooses the lowest of our instruments, right, the cello, playing this, and with the highest of the voices, depicting this heavenly journey. And there's this sense of complete joyful abandon, the release of all worldly troubles and worries. And I interpret, there's these big leaps of the 10th in the cello. Bum pia da di da di da di da di da 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 dum bum 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 ba da da dum bum bum pi da di da di da dum bum bum pi da. Suddenly, the large leaps, chromatic, tortured leaps of the tenor aria now suddenly don't seem so strange. And there's this sense of absolute relief and joyful abandon in this duet where they, and I want to just also draw attention to, I'm reminded of, it was a few years earlier that Bach wrote what we now call the wedding cantata, BWV 202. And I think it's the third aria, or the third movement, the first real, second aria that the soprano sings is about Phoebus rushing to her lover. And it's the same dance form. And there are a lot of similarities. And now here, as opposed to Phoebus rushing to her lover, it's the believer rushing to heaven or rushing to be with Christ in death. So we see Bach, the secular composer, infiltrating his sacred music and using these earthly dance forms. And then the final thing I'll bring up is that in the final chorale, to me what's interesting is the bass line, because we have what we might call a walking bass, or these coupled eighth notes in the continuo and in the bass of the choir. And I'm drawn to the second line of text, which is Geh ich ihm ewig an der Seiten, or I will walk at his side. And to me, that's the sort of the accompanying figure of the believer walking with Christ as represented by the bass line of I will walk at his side. And there's this regal yet restrained statement of faith at the end. And I've, in interpreting it and conducting it, I've made the choice of the final phrase of Meinen, Jesum, nicht. They've all throughout have been these sort of full-throated, clinging ideas. And so it strikes that in this big journey which you referenced, there's some repose at the end, perhaps. And I've made the choice to ask the choir and to sing something more piano, and the instruments to play, the strings to play flautando, so that they're out of the way of the voices. And you think you're going to get just this beautiful repose taking us to a nice E major chord, which we do, but there's one last word, and that is the penultimate note where we hear this, the burr, which is snagged again. The soprano sings an E natural against the alto's D sharp. And there's that little bit of point of tension, which then makes that resolution repose to the E major, I think, all the more meaningful.
Yeah, I think it's an extraordinarily detailed chorale setting. Something that I've had discussions with students in the past is this question that keeps coming up, well, were the congregations singing along in these final chorales? And while it's possible to imagine that maybe they were singing the melody, you can't possibly think that they could be singing these very intricate part settings. They're nothing like the harmonizations that they would have known. And in fact, it's so obvious that the composer is doing important signifying work in the way he writes the parts, right? Another thing I hear in this chorale is the gluiness of all the suspensions has that sort of kleben feeling.
The clinging.
To it.
Indeed, yeah.
One thing I'd love to point out about the text in the final chorale, which again comes directly from the hymn, is that the very last line says, "Blessed is whoever says with me, I will not let go of Jesus." In other words, there's quotations around that final statement.
Yes.
It basically is inviting the listeners to say, now we all say it together, right? It's not just my personal statement of faith, I'm not going to let go, but everyone else needs to say it too, which is obviously a huge part of the message that a cantata wants to convey, is that this is a message for you. And if Ryan will indulge me, I want to walk back through some of the movements that he went through, and I want to talk about a question that comes up a lot in Baroque music, which is this idea of text painting. Does Bach do it? Why does he do it? How does it work, right? And I think that we have some examples of that. Certainly the long-held unison note in the choir in the first movement, the kleben, that is an extremely obvious use of text painting. It's quite fun when you suddenly hear, it feels like everything stops, right? Even though the instruments are still playing, the singers feel like they just got frozen in time. We have little imagery. I'm going to jump around a little bit in the bass recit. When he turns everything around, he says, "My faith looks up," or "I look up faithfully," and the voice rises up to its highest note, which is a high E. Very, very obvious, sort of directing the gaze upward with the pitches.
As opposed to 3 measures earlier when he talks about the journey in the wilderness and the pit of martyrdom, where he puts the bass at its lowest point.
Right. The risk with this type of discussion is that it tends to sound like we're trivializing or simplifying the gestures. And in fact, the experience of hearing this is anything but. I think that there are other examples. One of the most, to me, astonishing things about the tenor aria is the cadence at the end of the major sections, where when he's singing this beautiful duet with the oboe in sixth, as Ryan described, and he says, "Ich lass ich Jesum nicht." So that's an unusual cadential figure. Generally, if you're going to sing leading tone octave, then you would stay on the same note to cadence. But there's this fantastically assertive drop of an octave. It happens both at the end of the sort of major section, and then it happens at the end in the tonic. And it's a quite striking sort of. You cannot call this text painting, but you can certainly say that Bach is making a very strong psychological depiction of the confidence that is in this line, the Zuversicht, that no, nicht, and by dropping the octave on that nicht, it makes it all the stronger. It's really a quite moving and compelling moment. I find the experience of the tenor aria pretty extraordinary as a listener. The drum beat that Ryan described, it also has overtones of like a shudder. He talks about the senses weakening and my Glieder rühret, which means my limbs are stirring, but it could be trembling.
Yeah, it talks about the fear and terror as well, yes.
And I think that what is really extraordinary about the way that Bach embodies these imagery is that they can become, I'm going to use a fancy word here, multisemiotic. They can represent many things at the same time. So when we talk about text painting or sort of elaborating things. It's not a one-to-one so much, but it's sort of opening up things that in the experience of the music, you find yourself participating. I believe that Bach, at his very greatest, is trying to bring the listener into the experience by the power of what he's doing. The sense that we feel confused or betrayed even by a harmonic gesture that doesn't go where we expect it to go, or that we are following one melodic line and then we lose it. You know, it gets buried in something else. Those are the moments when I think that the composer pulls us out of our sort of safe place and puts us in the middle of the action. I obviously focus a lot on words, and I think, you know, we don't want to lose track of the message and the story that Bach is using as his framework. But I think that these pieces would not be interesting to us if we didn't have Bach's music, right? It's not the text itself that we are interested in. What's interesting is how Bach uses this amazing, unparalleled gift that he had for making the notes do what he wanted them to do in order to create moments that are so vivid and personal that they grab you in the moment and they force you to participate.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I'm looking at my phone here because I'm getting questions fed to me from Brad.
Oh, well, let's
so
move to
I think this is a great time to transition into that. And somebody wrote, and I think it also feels really compelling to sing this music, let alone listen to it, that there's, it ties into this constant concern for an uncertain future that we're all struggling with right now. One specific question is, would you explain the different formatting of the cantata translations? There are indents, italics, bold. What do they mean?
Oh, that's so great. What a great question.
Isn't it?
And thank you for asking, because that is something that is there to communicate some very useful information. So in our text today, we basically see bold and then what we call, plain face type. And the bold represents literal chorale verses. In other words, anything in bold was exactly what would be sung in the hymn book. Mm-hmm. Words that come from sometimes a century earlier. If we know who wrote the text of the chorale, we credit that poet. So in this case, we have Christian Kemann, and the date of that poem is 1587. So that is, 150 years prior to when the rest of the text was written. If a text is in plain typeface, then it is a modern to Bach's time, contemporary to Bach's time, written by, in this case, an unknown poet, but in some other cantatas by Bach, we can name the poet. It might be Christian Marian von Ziegler, or it might be Picander, or some other poets that he collaborated with. If you see a text in italic, it means it's a biblical quote. And those usually will be recognizable, but it's important that they stand out, because I think that for a listener, they would stand out. I know that text. What's fascinating is when, in the course of a single movement, you see the typeface changing, which is signaling to you, oh my goodness, the poet has been telling us his own version of something, but now he's just simply dropped in a quote directly from the hymn. It's as if you're singing something and you find yourself saying, "How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," and we would all know, oh, that's a quote from Amazing Grace. Everyone would know that. So it's a way of sort of catching our eye.
And that is we don't see it in this cantata, obviously, but that's that sort of recitative hybrid arioso format is something we see a lot in Bach, where he might set the new poetry as recitative, and then you hear the chorale tune coming in as either like an arioso, you would see the text in bold there. And then Bach helps us along with the way he treats it musically to draw our ear to that chorale tune and that chorale text.
Yeah.
Well, Pam, this has been great. I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions, and we don't. Is there anything you'd like to add to close us out?
You know, I want to say something about the comment that you got about our uncertain times. And the fact that when we are performing these works and studying these works, it's obviously very important to understand where the text comes from, to understand the liturgical context and the environment and the mindset of the 18th century Lutheran that Bach very clearly was. But as performers, we are responsible to take our material and make strong choices that bring the music to life. That is our job. And we have to engage the music from our own perspective and our own experience. And what we find, and I think performers all over and of all times would agree with this, that the music that was not intended to refer to a 21st century democracy that is struggling with its identity, for instance, as a hypothetical example, that resonances exist that feel just as real and are just as important for us to engage in our own performance of these works. That's not a betrayal of the composer's intent. We cannot say the composer intended it to be that, but great music transcends its origin, I think. And I think that's the key to how we can respectfully embrace and love these works and make them feel alive, by recognizing that what they were meant to be in one time and place is still true, but can also be brought into other times and places and still speak to us.
That put so poignantly. I don't know if I can add more to that other than to say one of I think the hallmarks of Emmanuel Music's 50-year history of doing cantatas is a phrase that we've thrown around a lot, but Bach's music is a living laboratory. That these are not museum pieces. They can be, and that we need to be incredibly informed and understand the context, but that they resonate with the performer, with, in our case, the parishioner, or with the audience member, the listener, in a way that is real right now for where each individual person is on their own journey, either musically or emotionally or spiritually. And I think Bach's music serves to do that, whether it was intended to or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are also so grateful to Emmanuel Church and the enlightened leadership that we've enjoyed for pretty much this entire program's history, for being able to see the power of that contextualization.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Pam. It's always exciting to have these conversations with you. You should know Pam and I never plan what we're going to say next to each other, and we try to feed off each other. And usually when there are students here, there are many questions that come up, and we can sort of read the room in a way that we can't hear. And we can't see each other, of course, other than our eyes with the masks. So this is a new format that's always exciting for us. So thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Ryan.
A ton. And just to our listeners, the next Bach Institute event will be tomorrow's worship service, which is live streamed, begins at 10 a.m. There will be a brief motet by Italian Renaissance composer Luca Marenzio, and then the cantata, this cantata we just discussed, Cantata 124, will take place somewhere before 11 a.m. And you can go to Emmanuel Music's YouTube channel or Emmanuel Church's YouTube channel to tune in to that. After that, our next event will be on Tuesday evening,
Yes.
I believe, and we will have a panel of string players, and the title of the panel is Period Practice for Modern Players. So thank you for tuning in. We hope we see you as this week progresses, and thanks again to Pamela Dalal. Have a good afternoon.